All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get started. So we did some heavy lifting on Tuesday, thinking about how we are going to move volume out of the loop of Henle, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. And we started by thinking about the osmotic gradient that exists in the medullary space, and then we're going to wander down and think about our hormones today. Okay? We did talk about, as a quick reminder, what that actually is, that osmotic gradient in that medullary space, how we had this concentrated region in the medullary space that we were going to put our loop of Henle, or drive our loop of Henle through. Our loop of Henle goes down through the medullary space, the descending limb, the ascending limb goes back up through it, and then the collecting duct, distal tubule, and the collecting duct come back down through it, okay? And that this was the drive to move water. And we saw that when we couple that concentrated space with the characteristics of the tube, right, where the tube was the descending limb of the loop of Henle, permeable to water, the ascending thin limb, permeable to sodium, okay, that we have different characteristics of the tube placed in this strange concentration gradient in that medullary space, okay? Then we were able to show how we could take things off, out of the tube into that interstitial space, and then putting a vasa recta over on top of that, how then we would remove what we took off into the interstitial space back into the peritubular capillary, right? So that's where we've been. We then talked a little bit about how the physics of a loop, especially this bit right here, actually makes this gradient, and the physics of this loop then can then change this gradient, okay? Because we have talked about ADH, vasopressin, and how we already know that that's going to make this this part of the tubule, distal tubule and the collecting duct, more permeable to water. Okay, well, we have to drive the water to move. Partly we're going to drive that water to move by the existing concentration gradient in the medullary space, and then we're going to be able to change that concentration in the medullary space. Okay, so we're going to look at that today. So we're going to look at so what we've done there is we've looked at the osmotic gradient that exists in the medullary space, and now we're going to move on to number 2 to think about ADH. I've got to find my new paper. There we are. There it is. Okay, so let's think about number 2, what happens with ADH? And how is that going to change fluid movement out of the loop of Henle, distal tube, and the collecting duct? So just transporting the information that we already learned from a previous overhead. As a reminder, ADH acts on the distal tubule and the collecting duct. The principal cells, okay, so a very specific cell type down here to increase water permeability. And it did that by inserting water channels, those aquaporins. Okay, so if suddenly this region, this is our distal tubule and our collecting duct over here, suddenly more permeable to water, let's then go through what would happen in this scenario. Okay, so again, we would start at the end of the proximal tubule. So remember all that obligatory movement at the proximal tubule, took all kinds of stuff out. We end up with fluid coming through the descending limb of the loop of Henle, osmolarity 300 milliosmoles, and we're going to run it through that medullary space, right, which starts out at the cortex level at 300 milliosmoles, and as we move that fluid down through the concentration gradient where it's permeable to water, okay, water will move to dilute, Okay, so we begin to concentrate the inside of the tubule. We don't actually equilibrate as we move vertically through, but remember, as we move horizontally through, we equilibrate with our external environment, right? So the osmolarity on the inside of the tubule becomes 1,400 milliosmoles because we moved water out. We concentrated it by moving water. And then as we move that fluid up through the thin ascending limb, where it's now impermeable to water but permeable to sodium, it's very concentrated sodium on the inside. As we move that back up through the concentration gradient or the medullary space, so sodium will move down its concentration gradient. Okay, this is exactly what was going to be happening in the absence of ADH. Okay, this is just how the kidney's working. We flow that fluid past the thick ascending limb by those transporters, where we, there's magical chloride ion there, where we move ions, sodium, chloride, and potassium. Okay, so now we're actually moving them out, not necessarily according to any concentration gradient. And we end up with the early distal tubule with a fluid on the inside of the tube being an osmolarity of 100 milliosmoles. So then we move that fluid through the late distal tubule in the collecting duct, which is now permeable to water, right? Because we've got ADH present, we've put those aquaporins in. So now as we move down the concentration gradient one last time, and water will then move to dilute. Okay, so now we are moving water again, just like we did in the thin descending limb, we are now moving water out to dilute. Okay, which then concentrates what's on the inside of the tube and decreases the volume, right? Because we've just moved it from the tube, the lumen of the tubule, into that interstitial space. Okay, so we can end up with small volumes of concentrated urine in the presence of ADH, right? So the presence of ADH really allows us to move water a second time in a similar manner as we did through the descending limb of the loop of Henle, okay? And again, we remove what we took into the interstitial space by that vasa recta overlaying on top of that, okay, with no particular permeability characteristics. So we can move a certain amount of water now, or more water, from the tubule to the interstitial space. And of course, the whole goal of this is to not allow fluid to be removed from the body. Once fluid is removed from the body, we can't get it back. But if we can put it into the interstitial space, we can then get it back, right? So this is the body trying to conserve fluids, keep them from leaving. But if the highest concentration that your medullary space is 1,400, then the osmolarity of the urine leaving can only be that, ever, right? Because we're driving water based on that. So there's a certain limit to the effectiveness of ADH unless ADH can change the concentration gradient here. Okay, so ADH can allow the tube to become more permeable, but we could even move more water if we could concentrate the space out here, change that concentration gradient, and then we would actually drive even more water to move, okay, which is exactly what ADH does. So ADH is going to do two things for us. I'll write them down. So let's think then about the actions of ADH at the kidney. Okay, so first of all, we already know that it makes the distal tubule and the collecting duct more permeable to water. Okay, so we got that one nailed. But we've also talked about ADH as a vasoconstrictor. and of the entire system. So that's going to be something that that's going to help us with total peripheral resistance when we get there. But at the level of the kidney, it's a vasoconstrictor of afferents over efferents. Okay? So vasoconstrictor of afferents greater than efferents. Okay, so what does this mean for flow into and out of our different capillary beds? So we had afferent arterioles upstream of our glomerular capillary bed, right? So that's right at the glomerulus Bowman's capsule where we were filtering. And then we had our efferent arterioles downstream of that glomerular capillary bed, but upstream of our peritubular capillaries. So remember, 2 capillaries in series here, a bit weird. And this is also our vasa recta. Okay, that's also part of that capillary bed. All right. So if we think about these volume into, volume out of arguments, should be pretty slick with them by now. If I am going to vasoconstrict afferents over efferents, what is going to happen to pressure in the glomerulus? I'm going to vasoconstrict afferents over efferents. What's going to happen? Someone take me through what happens to pressure in that glomerulus. See it? The volume in, volume out argument. No, don't want to go through it today. Yeah. Less volume in, less pressure. Yeah, perfect. So we have less volume into, right? And less volume in on the inflow argument, and let's say outflow was constant, right? So even in that scenario, if we have less in, out's constant, less into, and out of is constant, then we have less in, right? Decreased volume in, decreased pressure in. Perfect. So I'm just going to jump here to this decrease in pressure in the glomerulus because you know all that volume in, volume out argument. So decreased pressure in that glomerulus, all right? And then if we were to look back, we would note that that would decrease our glomerular filtration rate. We would filter less, okay? So we're going to decrease our filtration rate. This is going to cause a decrease in the tubular flow. Okay, so now the volume in the tube is moving slower. Flow is a volume per unit time, so now it's moving slower. So we have a decrease in flow in that tubule, and what that means for the tubule is a change in equilibration time, okay? So this is going to then, if we're moving slower, then any time that that volume of fluid is sitting at any piece of the tubule, it's staying there longer, isn't it? So we actually are increasing our equilibration time at any piece of the tubule. So I'm increasing my equilibration time. Now, critically, this means that I'm going to spend more time at the thick ascending limb by those transporters moving ions out, okay? I'm going to increase my equilibration time. So now I'm going to spend more time in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. All right, so I'm going to be spending more time there, which means I'm going to be able to remove more sodium, more chloride, and more potassium. Okay? So I've got an increase in sodium out into the interstitial space. All right, so I've just moved more ions from the lumen of the tubule into that interstitial space. So I've just concentrated that interstitial space, okay? Or concentrated that medullary space. So this will only work to concentrate that medullary space if I don't have the vasa recta take it off, right? So if the vasa recta just takes off this extra stuff, then the medullary space will remain at the same concentration gradient, okay? So then let's look at what's happening downstream at the vasa recta. Because the vasa recta and the peritubular capillary flow will be affected by that vasoconstriction of afferents, okay? We are going to get a decrease then in volume into the peritubular capillaries, right? So we're going to have a decrease in flow here. So this is going to be the first time we're going to think about flow through a capillary bed, because it becomes important in terms of equilibration time. So we will drop the flow going through that vasa recta. That vasoconstriction is going to decrease the flow through here. So if I decrease that flow through the peritubular capillary bed, I'm going to increase my equilibration time. Okay? Same type of argument. I'm going to put this argument down, and then we're going to look at the tube and see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to write it down here first, and then we're going to go back to the tubule to see it work. So that increase in equilibration time is going to result in removing R-E-M-O-V-I-N-G. There we go. Removing less solute. That's not what I want to remove. Okay, I'm going to remove less solute from the interstitial space, or that medullary space. Okay, therefore, I'm going to concentrate the medullary space. Okay, so get that down, and then we'll go take a look. Where's it gone? Oh, here it is. Okay, so let's take a look at that argument for a minute. It's a bit tricky. Okay, so now we're talking about what we've done is we've slowed flow past the thick ascending limb, right? So we've allowed more sodium and chloride and potassium to move out into this interstitial space. Okay, then we've got that vasa recta sitting over on top of this. And under normal conditions, right? Remember, under normal conditions with the vasa recta, it's got blood on the inside, right? It's a capillary, that we would flow blood vertically through that concentration gradient, right? So we would move sodium down its concentration gradient, right? So we were picking things up on this side, concentrate on the inside. And as we flowed horizontally through, we equilibrated with the extracellular or the interstitial space of that medullary space. And then we flowed vertically through again, right? So as we flowed vertically through, we came really concentrated and then shot that volume straight up through the concentration gradient. We will bring on water as it moves to dilute now, but because we are moving vertically through the concentration gradient, we don't have enough time to equilibrate. So normally the medullary space would be, in the cortex, would be about 300, right? Well, we just don't have time to equilibrate with it because we're flowing vertically through. So we leave a little more concentrated because we just don't have time to equilibrate, okay? That was our normal scenario. So now what happens when you slow everything down? When you slow this whole thing down, now we do have time to equilibrate, right? So if I do have time to equilibrate as I move down, and then vertically as I move through, we always had time to equilibrate, right? And then I move slowly up through here, I have time to equilibrate. I'm actually going to then leave not at 320, but I'm going to leave at 300 because I had time to equilibrate. So where did the extra 20 milliosmoles go? They stayed in the interstitial space. Okay, so we left, the blood leaves less concentrated. It used to be 320, it's now leaving at 300. But those 20 milliosmoles have to be somewhere. Okay, they're in the medullary space. So what the vasorecta did was remove less solute from the medullary space. You see that? We removed less solute. So slowing flow down in the lumen of the tubule removed more solute, right, into the interstitial space. Slowing the vasorecta down removed less solute, so it's in the medullary space. So by vasoconstricting those afferents, the tube was able to concentrate the medullary space. We now have more solutes in that medullary space. It's now more concentrated, okay? So that maneuver, both of these, work to change the concentration gradient. Okay, so now not only have we made that tubule more permeable, we've concentrated the medullary space. So now it doesn't go from 300 to 1400, it might go from 300 to 1700. Now we're going to draw, that's a greater drive for water. Okay, so we made it more permeable and we increased the drive. Okay, so both of these maneuvers are an act to increase the drive to move water. And increase water reabsorption. The more concentrated it is, now when we make it more permeable, we will move more water, okay? So two mechanisms for ADH to act at the level of the kidney, okay? Makes it more permeable to water, and it changes the osmotic gradient in the medullary space, okay? So, let's then, are we okay with that? Well, that's a tough one. That's a tough one for like before 9 in the morning. You guys are hardcore. Good? It's a tough one. Make sure you can reverse this, okay? Make sure you can reverse it. If we were to decrease ADH, make sure you can go through that argument in the opposite way. It's exact opposite, so I know you'll get it. But make sure that you practice that. Oh, I thank goodness for my kidneys every day. I can't believe we get up and walk around every day with this stuff having to happen. It's hardcore. All right, let's then think about, if the presence of ADH does all that, then let's think hard about where ADH comes from. What provokes it? So you would have learned in Human Phys 1 that ADH is released at the level of the brain from the posterior pituitary. It's under control of hypothalamic control, so we plug things into the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus can change their action potential, frequency, and patterns of neurons, and then we're going to get ADH release, okay? So there's two stimuli for ADH. One is a hemodynamic stimulus, and another is an osmotic stimulus, okay? So that means we have to have hemodynamic sensors and osmotic sensors, right? So let's think about the hemodynamic first. So, hemodynamic stimulus. So we've already talked about these. They were our high and low pressure baroreceptors. Okay, if we go back and look at those sensors that we talked about how changing the high and low pressure baroreceptor sensor action potential frequency and pattern would change, go up into the brain, and head off into the hypothalamus. Okay, the reason we were heading off into the hypothalamus was to change ADH release. So there's information already that we've talked about regarding these guys. So these high and low pressure baroreceptors. Change the action potential frequency and pattern of high and low pressure baroreceptors to send information to the brainstem. That then changes the action potential frequency and pattern to nerves in the hypothalamus. So just a little passing of the information. And then the hypothalamus will change the behavior of ADH secreting cells. So tonic signals from these baroreceptors, because these baroreceptors are always sending a signal, right? They're never off, because you always have a pressure in the high and low pressure baroreceptors, so in your aorta, in your carotid artery, and over on the low pressure side of things, right atria, pulmonary arteries. We've always got this tonic level of signaling that inhibits ADH release, right? So this tonic signaling is inhibiting ADH release. So tonic signals from the baroreceptors are going to inhibit ADH. So if we had a situation there for when we drop blood volume and we dropped mean arterial pressure, we would drop the action potential frequency from these receptors, from the high and low pressure baroreceptors, and drop the inhibition on the cells. Okay? ADH would go up. Right, got it? Let's write that. So if I decrease blood volume, or decrease mean arterial pressure, I'm going to decrease my action potential frequency from the sensors. That's going to decrease inhibition. And increase ADH. Okay, which is exactly what this graph is telling us, that if we have a change in blood volume or blood pressure, if we have so we live here on this graph. You have to change the blood volume or blood pressure by about 10% before we're going to start to see an increase in ADH release. Okay, so drop blood volume or blood pressure and we inhibit the inhibition, increase ADH. Okay, straightforward. So we also have osmoreceptors that are plugged into the system. So we do, osmolarity is another regulated variable. So we've been dealing hard with mean arterial pressure as a regulated variable. Osmolarity is another one. So we like to keep our osmolarity constant. So there will be an osmotic stimuli for ADH release. These osmoreceptors are right at the level of the hypothalamus. Okay, so those sensors are right there in the brain. This is why part of that hypothalamus, if you learned this in Human Phys 1, part of the hypothalamus isn't behind the blood-brain barrier. So that you've got all of the brain is behind the blood-brain barrier except a little bit of this hypothalamus, right? So this, so that hypothalamus can then monitor what is in the blood, right? If we tuck it behind a blood-brain barrier, it doesn't quite know exactly what's in the blood system, right? So part of it is exposed, part of the hypothalamus is exposed to, or is not protected by that blood-brain barrier, and this would be why. So that's the place that we're going to tuck these osmoreceptors, so in that hypothalamus. Okay, so action potential frequency of neuron, and then what they will do is change the action potential frequency of the neurons releasing ADH. All right, so if we have an increase in osmolarity, we're going to get an increase in ADH. Okay, makes sense. If our blood becomes concentrated, then we want to make sure we get back as much fluid as we can from the level of the kidney to help dilute that. Okay. We are very sensitive to changes in osmolarity. Okay, so that's what this graph is telling us, that if we have changes in osmolarity, an increase in osmolarity is going to result in an increase in ADH. We live with an osmolarity of around 290. So very small, so we live on the steep part of the curve, the very sensitive part of the curve. So very small changes in osmolarity will result in a change in ADH, right? It could be as small as 1%. So even a 1% change in plasma osmolarity is going to alter our ADH release. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a problem, because these two sensors can actually get themselves working against each other, okay, or working in the opposite direction when it comes to ADH release, right? So, for example, let's say we would have a decreased blood volume problem, okay? So fell down, hit your head, unfortunately, and you've got a decrease in blood volume occurring. So based on your hemodynamic stimulus, you would drop that blood volume and you would increase ADH release, right? So we would do this, right? Which is great, because what ADH is doing is we would want to make sure that we are gaining or not losing fluids from the body, but getting as much fluid back at the level of the kidney and putting it back in the blood compartment. That's the whole reason for that maneuver, right? So life is good. We've got ADH on board. Through all of the reasons we just discussed, that would increase water resorption, which is great. That would help us increase our blood volume. Awesome. We will survive. Problem is we just brought back water. We've just moved fluid from that kidney into the peritubular capillary, which will now start to dilute the blood. Okay? Because we just brought back fluids. So we're now going to dilute the blood, and only a 1% change in osmolarity can change ADH production, right? So the problem is that we brought back that water, which is fantastic, but then we're going to decrease our plasma osmolarity. Okay, and if this graph, we decrease our plasma osmolarity, we drop ADH. So based on these two sensors, we will never be able to fix our blood volume problem, okay? Unless somebody changes. And what does change then is the sensitivity of this osmoreceptor, okay? So in a scenario where there is a decrease, that's our scenario here, a decrease in blood volume, okay, the relationship shifts to the left and becomes a little more steep. Okay, so we shift our set point. So this is just a sensor that's shifted its set point, right? So its normal set point was here. So we've shifted the set point back, and then the relationship becomes much more sensitive, much more steep, right? So what this means then is under normal conditions, right? So under our normal conditions, we had 290 milliosmoles was our blood osmolarity, and that was producing a certain amount of ADH release just under normal conditions, right? Because it's never zero. That's now suddenly, if we shift the relationship to the left and make it more steep, and our blood osmolarity is 290, we actually go way off the charts in terms of ADH release. We hit maximum, right? And in fact, if we really wanted to see what would happen, we would have to extend this way out in order to see that an osmolarity of 290 is now going to produce a maximum amount of ADH production. Okay, so now when we start to dilute, so now when we go from 290 to 289 to 288, and we start changing that osmolarity by 1%, we will be releasing more ADH than we were in the first place. Okay, so even though the dilution will result in less ADH production, since we maxed out ADH production in the first place, the net sum of ADH is still higher than it was before. Do you see that? So we're getting ADH out based on the hemodynamic stimulus, change the relationship, get a really high amount of ADH being produced because of these osmoreceptors, and now as we begin to dilute, we will start to release less ADH as we come down because of that dilution, but we're still in a net gain scenario. We still have more ADH on board than we did prior to the blood volume problem, okay? So this shift is absolutely required for us to fix this problem, okay? The argument is going to happen exactly the opposite in the other direction too. Okay, so make sure you work through that scenario where if I had an increase in blood volume, what might happen? Indeed, we have a shift in the osmoreceptor sensitivity to the right. We shift its set point, become less sensitive. Okay? So it's the exact same, just the opposite. Okay, so we can manage now getting ADH out, where it's coming from, how we're going to control it. Okay, and now we know once we get it out there, exactly what it's doing to the level of the kidney. Changing permeability and then constricting those afferents, which causes a whole lot of other stuff to happen. Okay? So that is number 2 on our list of things that mess with the loop of Henle, the distal tube, and the collecting duct. Okay? Now we're heading on to more hormones. We're totally hormonal today. More hormones. This one a little more straightforward. In its activity, atrial natriuretic peptide. So this one has come up a couple of times. It's a product of a volume sensor in the right atria. So we have cells sitting in that right atria that when they stretch, they release atrial natriuretic peptide. So it's coming right from the right atria itself. Okay? So we've been releasing atrial natriuretic peptide every time we increase venous return. So if you go back to those cardiovascular mechanics exercises that we did, every time we messed with venous return, we will have changed atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, that would have been its stimulus. So if we increase venous return, increase volume, okay, so we've increased volume back in that right atria, we've stretched that right atria, and that stretch causes the release of atrial natriuretic peptide from cells hanging out right there. Okay. So what does atrial natriuretic peptide do? Well, this was the one that had some crazy behavior at the level of afferents and efferents. It was a vasodilator of afferents, so more in. Vasoconstrictor of efferents, less out. Okay? So by vasodilating afferents and vasoconstricting efferents, it's going to result in a large increase in pressure in the glomerulus, which is going to result in a large increase in GFR. Okay. On top of that, it messes with the hormones that we've already been talking about. So on top of that, it can decrease ADH, which is going to decrease the permeability of the distal tubular collecting duct, so just do all the opposite of what we just talked about. So we're going to decrease the permeability of the distal tubular collecting duct through 100 steps. That's going to decrease water reabsorption, therefore increase water excretion. Okay, so not only are we going to filter more, we're going to cause more to be excreted. So obviously you can see the primary goal of atrial natriuretic peptide. So I'm going to put some placeholders here because we're just about to talk about them next, what they do to renin. So I'm going to write this down and you'll know what it means in a minute. So it's going to inhibit renin, which is going to inhibit angiotensin II and decrease aldosterone. Okay, angiotensin II is something that can stimulate ADH, so decreasing angiotensin II will decrease ADH. We'll see that in connection in a minute. It can also decrease in aldosterone directly. All right, and what did aldosterone do? So we visited aldosterone already. It changed those symporters in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Aldosterone was able to increase those, so dropping aldosterone will decrease the number of symporters. So decrease the number of supporters in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Okay, so we're going to decrease the amount of sodium, chloride, and potassium we move out of the tubule. Okay, and critical to this would be that sodium, because if we're going to decrease sodium movement, we're going to decrease water reabsorption, because water follows sodium. Decrease water reabsorption. And increase water excretion. So obviously, everything that atrial natriuretic peptide is doing is working to increase water excretion, right? Makes sense because its stimulus was a potential increase in volume problem. Increase in venous return might mean that we have an increase in volume on board, so we then need to work to decrease our volume. Okay, you can see that everything that H1 natriuretic peptide is doing is working towards that goal. We're going to filter more and then increase and get less back. Okay, so it's definitely singularly focused in terms of what it's doing, even though it's tapping into a fair number of hormones to do that. Okay, so the last set of hormones, or the last suite of hormones that we have to think about, is our renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So the good thing about these three is that you get them as a suite or you don't. Right, so there's not like three separate ones you have to memorize in terms of one going up and one going down and one going sideways. Okay, they're either all going up or they're all going down, because they all hinge on the same enzyme or hormone to produce them all. So you either get them or you don't. So we start with the precursor, angiotensinogen. Right, so this is going to be produced in the liver and released in the blood. So this is circulating all the time. So angiotensinogen is a product of the liver being circulated at all times. So produced in the liver and released in the blood. So its supply is not going to be rate limiting for us. It's just always going to be there. Renin, it is converted, angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1 by renin, and renin is released from cells of the afferent and efferent arterioles. Okay, so right down at the level of the kidney is where we're getting the thing that will start the whole process of making angiotensin 2 and aldosterone. So renin is released from cells of afferent and efferent arterioles. And that will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay, and that is an enzyme that you're going to find on endothelial cells lining the kidney and lining the lung. So the entire vasculature is lined with endothelial cells, but the ones at the level of the kidney and the ones at the level of the lung seem to have this ACE enzyme, which is then going to convert. If we can get angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, it'll flow by those into those two vascular beds and convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So we need angiotensin converting enzyme to do that for us. We'll find this on endothelial cells of the kidney. I think they're afferent arterioles in particular. And the lung. So we're going to see that this is going to be a way for us to get a little bit of angiotensin 1, a little bit of angiotensin 2, or a lot of angiotensin 2. We're going to be able to get a little bit of angiotensin 2 by conversion at the level of the afferent arterioles, and then if we need a lot of it, then we're going to get a lot of conversion at the level of the lung vasculature, because it's a massive vascular bed, right? Okay, then we convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. What does angiotensin 2 do? So we've dropped this one a little bit along the way systemically, so in the whole body. Systemically, we talked about it being a potent vasoconstrictor. So it's a potent vasoconstrictor of systemic arterioles. we saw that systemically it would be a vasoconstrictor of afferents equal to efferents. Okay, so this maneuver will not change pressure in the glomerulus, and it's not going to change GFR, but it will change renal blood flow. So this is a way to divert blood from even going to the kidney in the first place. So we can decrease renal blood flow this way. So we're going to see all these behaviors when we have high concentrations of angiotensin II. Okay, let's take a break, and we'll get back to what happens when we have low concentrations of angiotensin II. Okay, let's quickly get back to our hormones here. We left poor angiotensin II hanging at high concentrations. So high concentrations of angiotensin II, potent vasoconstrictor. So we're going to pull this out to change total peripheral resistance and mean arterial pressure. So that's where that's going to be. That's going to be working for us. And that's when we have high concentrations in the whole body. Okay? That's going to be slightly different than when we just have low concentrations right at the level of the kidney. Okay? So locally, if we have small amounts of angiotensin II just right at the level of the kidney, it will cause a vasoconstriction of efferents greater than afferents. Okay, if it's going to vasoconstrict efferents over afferents, we're going to get normal constant volume into the glomerular capillary bed, less volume out of. So we're going to get more volume in and more pressure in. That's going to result in an increase in GFR. So this local effect, this weird little local effect, will actually cause an increase in GFR. And we'll look at how we might get that, because I think it might be an anatomical issue. So this is what's going to happen at low concentrations. Okay? And we will go over the two scenarios where we might have one versus the other. What else does angiotensin II do? It stimulates ADH. So we stimulate ADH release. And of course, we already know that ADH is a systemic vasoconstrictor. All right, so that's going to help us out with TPR. And then we know that it's a vasoconstrictor of afferents greater than efferents. So it's going to be working towards decreasing GFR. There's also a membrane receptor population on the adrenal glands where we're going to be releasing aldosterone for angiotensin II. Okay, so angiotensin II, membrane receptor on adrenal glands to increase the amount of aldosterone. And so aldosterone was messing with those symporters at the level of the thick ascending limb. So this maneuver is going to increase the number of symporters. And I think the sodium-potassium pump increase sodium reabsorption, increase water reabsorption. Okay, so if you look at everything this whole axis is doing, aside from that one little blip right there, we'll cover it up for a minute. If we look at everything that this axis is doing, it's looking like it's going to be working to decrease GFR, increase water reabsorption. Okay, it's all working in the same direction. So when we get the trio out, they're all working towards the same goal, right? So not a big surprise that we're going to see these come out when we have a decreased blood volume problem, right? Because these are all things that would work towards not losing water, so decreased GFR, and increasing water reabsorption, increasing blood volume. Okay, so drop in mean arterial pressure, we should fully expect this suite of them to come out. Okay, except for that one little blip, which is going to be a little bit about local regulation of the kidney and not necessarily whole body regulation. Okay, so that's the difference between when we talk about systemically, like what's happening all over here, right, versus what's happening right at the level of the kidney. Okay? And we will differentiate between those two. They are not working they're not working against each other, they're doing two very separate things. So, but we'll get to that in a minute. So obviously, to get the whole suite out, the linchpin is renin. If you have renin, you have angiotensin II, ADH, and aldosterone. If you don't have renin, you don't have those three out here. Okay? ADH has some other stimuli, right? But indeed, if you don't have renin, you don't have angiotensin II, you don't have aldosterone. Okay? So the critical thing then is how do we release renin? Where's that coming from? Because if we know where that's coming from, then we know we're going to get the other two. Okay? So the game afoot is, where does renin come from? What's the stimulus for renin release? So we do have some local effects of renin. So remember, renin was released from those cells at the level of the kidney. Okay? So perfusion pressure of afferent arterioles. So afferent arterioles have high pressure baroreceptors too, just like the baroreceptors that we found at the level of the carotid artery and in the aorta, right? We have baroreceptors in the afferent arterioles, such that if we were to increase afferent arterial pressure or volume, we would drop renin. Okay, so this is kind of represents a local control of renin release. Okay, so we're going to change pressure right locally at the kidney. So we're going to change renin release right locally at the kidney. Okay, and then again, that happens every time you go from sitting down to standing up. You increase the pressure at the level of the afferent arterioles, you're going to change renin release a little bit, but that's just locally, right? You can also have the brain demand we have renin out there. Okay, so when the brain has registered a whole body problem, right, which will happen anytime your high pressure baroreceptors or low pressure baroreceptors are tweaked, right, change in mean arterial pressure starts to send signals, those sensors send signals to the brain. And so now the brain says, okay, I need some renin. So when the brain wants renin, when the central system wants renin, we have direct SNS innervation into the afferent and efferent arterioles to release renin. Okay, so this is like when there's a whole body alert, we want afferent and efferent arterioles to release renin, get it out there in the whole body. Okay, renin converts angiotensin into angiotensin 1. That whole body angiotensin 1 flows by the lung. We get lots of angiotensin 2 out there to be doing the things that whole body systemic angiotensin 2 do. Okay? That's the scenario where we would see high concentrations of systemic angiotensin 2, okay, when the brain wants it. So central control of the release of renin. Increased SNS activity, bam, increased renin. which is going to be increased angiotensin 2, increased aldosterone. Come out as a group. All right. And we'll see how those work when we put the whole body back together. And then there's this other little weird one. We can release renin based on the delivery of sodium chloride by the distal tubule to the macula densa. These are probably just useless syllables right now because we have no idea what the macula densa is or what this even means. So I'm going to write it down here that indeed a decrease in sodium chloride in the macula densa will cause, an increase in sodium chloride in the macula densa will cause a decrease in renin. So we've got to have, if this is going to work, sodium chloride in the macula densa. Sodium chloride, that macula densa is in the distal tubule. That means then there has to be some sort of chemoreceptor in the distal tubule for sodium. Okay? So we've got to have a chemoreceptor in the distal tubule. In the macula densa. All right, so what is this macula densa we speak of? Let's take a look at what that is. Okay, so here we are back at, let me orient you here. We're back at the where we are. We've got afferent arterioles, so we've got blood flowing in here. And then we've got our glomerular capillary bed, right? And then we flow through that, and our efferent arterioles. So just to orient you as to where this picture is. When we have blood coming through into the glomerular capillary bed, and we filter out into the Bowman's capsule. Right, so we've been talking about that. And then that Bowman's capsule, what we filter into the Bowman's capsule then moves into the proximal tubule. Okay, that was here. Okay, so this is really just a cross-section of the glomerular capillary bed, Bowman's capsule, and stuff going on there. Okay, really, so we've got our afferent and our efferent arterioles, and we have those, we have renin-releasing cells here. Okay, that's the first time we've seen those. So these are the renin-releasing cells of our afferent and our efferent arterioles that are connected to the sympathetic nervous system, right? So that graph where we saw increased SNS activity, this is where they were innervating. Bam, we have renin out of afferent or efferent arterioles out into the rest of the body. Okay, how's that maneuver? But this other little weird thing about sodium chloride in the macula densa, work on that a little bit. So very cool is this anatomical relationship between the afferent and efferent arterioles and the distal tubule. Okay. They're anatomically looped very specifically. So what we have, if we had, let's say, the Bowman's capsule here, it's kind of tricky to draw. If we have the Bowman's capsule and then our proximal tubule and then our thin descending limb and our thin ascending limb, all right, and then we have our thick ascending limb, and then we get into the distal tubule. That distal tubule curves right closely back to where the Bowman's capsule is. Okay, so this is our distal tubule. Now why it's curving back there, so it can be in very close proximity to afferent arterioles coming into that Bowman's capsule. All right, so that's that flow into that Bowman's capsule. And then flow into here, and then we had our efferent arterioles. Okay, so if you took a cross section then of what was going on right here, you would see the Bowman's capsule, the glomerulus, the afferent and efferent arterioles, and you would see the distal tubule. It's right there. Okay, so this is that part of the tubule curving back up to become in close proximity to afferent and efferent arterioles. Okay, so now what is in the tube is going to be able to influence what came into the tube. All right? Because remember, bless you. Do you remember vasoconstriction and vasodilation of afferent arterioles controlled glomerular filtration rate? So the amount of fluid coming in the tube was controlled by afferent and efferent arterioles, and suddenly then we're dipping that tube back to be able to feed back information to control what's coming into it. So that's what's happening here. So we've got then an area where they do come into close contact with each other called the macula densa. That means, so it's cells in the distal tubule. Parts of the cells in the distal tubule here are called the macula densa, specialized cells that can then sense sodium. It's going to be sensing sodium chloride, releasing a product to then affect renin-releasing cells to release renin. Okay? The macula densa plus the renin-releasing cells. Renin-releasing cells also have a fancy name, juxtaglomerular cells. Is what's called, them together, they're called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So it's that connection of cells of the distal tubule and renin-releasing cells called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Oh, you guys gotta go. That's too bad, it's so cool. So juxtaglomerular apparatus are cells of the macula densa plus juxtaglomerular cells. Okay, and we will talk later about how they work together. All right, have a good day.